Hello students, this video is my continuation of my previous video on cerebrum. So first please go through my previous video for better understanding. Now in my previous video I have already explained about there are two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so in between the hemisphere there is median longitudinal fissure. Okay, so in between the hemisphere there are median longitudinal fissure. So this is the median longitudinal fissure. Okay, so it is dividing the cerebrum into right cerebral hemisphere and left cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so it is dividing, but though it is cutting the cerebrum into two halves, there is a connection, and that connection is the medial surface of the cerebrum. Okay, the medial surface of the cerebrum. Now two hemisphere is connected via corpus callosum. Okay, so this is one part of cerebral hemisphere. Suppose this is one part of cerebral hemisphere. Okay, it is divided into two halves. So this is the, suppose this my hand is the right half. So the above is the superolateral surface. Then I turn. So I turn only little bit. So this is the medial surface. And then I turn completely. So this would be the inferior surface. So this is the superolateral surface, the medial surface, and the inferior surface. Now the two cerebral hemisphere is connected via the medial surface. Okay. Now this medial surface consists of C-shaped corpus callosum. This is corpus callosum. Above is cingulate gyri, that I will explain in detail later on. But the medial surface consists of corpus callosum and the ventricles. Ventricles are the empty cavities which are present in the brain where CSF is formed. Okay, so there is lateral ventricles which are right and left lateral ventricle for each cerebral hemisphere. This lateral ventricle is connected to the third ventricle which is present in the midbrain via interventricular foramina or foramen of Monro, connecting the lateral and the third ventricle. The third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle which is present near the pons and cerebellum, that is the hindbrain, and it is connected via cerebral aqueduct. Okay, it is connected via cerebral aqueduct. So these are the parts which are present in the medial surface of the cerebrum which connects the two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so these are the surfaces of the cerebrum. So if you see here, I will explain you right now. This is the superolateral surface which consists of lot of sulci and the gyri. Okay, so this is the superolateral surface of the cerebrum. I am talking about three surfaces of the cerebrum. The first surface is the superolateral surface, this, and it consists of lot of sulci and gyri. The other surface is medial surface. This medial surface is flat and vertical medially of the cerebral hemisphere. So this is medially of the cerebral hemisphere. Right now I explained. In between two medial surface, this is one medial surface of one cerebral hemisphere. In between two medial surface of the two cerebral hemisphere is presence of falx cerebri and longitudinal fissure. Okay, so in between the two medial surface, okay, in between the two medial surface of the two cerebral hemisphere, okay, of the two cerebral hemisphere, there is falx cerebri and the longitudinal fissure. Okay, so this is the longitudinal fissure. This is one half, this is one half. Okay, this is one half. If we are seeing this way, this is the medial surface, and if we see completely down, this becomes the inferior surface of one cerebral hemisphere. So medially there is presence of corpus callosum and lateral ventricles, and this medial surface is consisting of longitudinal fissure, which is separating the two cerebral hemisphere, and it consists of falx cerebri. Now what is falx cerebri? It is also known as cerebral falx. Okay, it is large crescent shaped fold of the meningeal layer of dura mater. So this falx cerebri is a fold of dura mater. You know, meninges, which are the covering of the brain. Okay, there is dura mater, arachnoid mater and pia mater. So falx cerebri is a fold of the dura mater. It's a fold of the dura mater, and this fold will get inserted inside this fissure. Okay, it will go inside this fissure. So this longitudinal fissure, inside this longitudinal fissure, dump inside this longitudinal fissure is falx cerebri, which is the fold of the meningeal layer of dura mater. Okay, so we talked about the medial surface. The medial surface is flat and vertical. In between the two medial surface, there is presence of falx cerebri. So this medial surface is present between two cerebral hemispheres. Yes, so there is medial surface which is present between the two cerebral hemispheres. This is one, this is the second, other would be the next side. So it consists of two cerebral hemispheres and two medial surfaces which connects the two cerebral hemispheres, and this medial surface is in between that is longitudinal fissure and the falx cerebri, that is the meningeal fold of dura mater. Okay, or the fold of dura mater. Clear? So that was about the superolateral surface, medial surface. Now we'll talk about the inferior surface. You can see this is the inferior surface. Inferior surface is irregular. Okay, it is very irregular, and it has two parts. Okay, the inferior surface is very irregular. It has two parts. The anterior part is the orbital surface, and the posterior part is the tentorial surface. And in between two parts is the lateral sulcus. Okay, you know what is lateral sulcus, that I have explained in detail in my previous video. So this is the superolateral surface of the cerebrum. Okay, it consists of many sulci and gyri. This is the medial surface. It consists of falx cerebri and the longitudinal fissure, and it is medially there is presence of corpus callosum and the ventricles. This is the inferior surface, the lower surface of the cerebrum. It is divided into two parts, the anterior part and the posterior part. The anterior part is known as the orbital surface, and the posterior part is known as the tentorial surface. And in between these two parts is the lateral sulcus. Okay, so there is presence of lateral sulcus in between these two parts. So this was about the surfaces of the cerebrum. Okay, so this is the lateral sulcus. So the anteriorly would be the, if we look inferiorly, so anteriorly would be the orbital surface, posteriorly would be the tentorial surface, and in between would be the lateral sulcus. Okay, so this is about the surfaces of the cerebrum. We'll proceed further to the borders. There are borders which are present in the cerebrum. Okay, first is the superomedial border. So surfaces was superolateral surface, the medial surface and the inferior surface. Now we'll proceed to the borders of the cerebrum. Which are the borders of the cerebrum? First is the superior medial border. Okay, The first border is the superomedial border. So you can see here, this is the superolateral surface, and see here, this is the superomedial border, superiorly and medial. So this is the superomedial border of the cerebrum. Okay. This superomedial border is between the superolateral surface and the medial surface. So you can see easily here, this is the superomedial border, and this border is present between the medial surface and the superolateral surface. This is the medial surface and the superolateral surface. Okay. So this is the superomedial border. This. Remember, present between the superolateral surface and the medial surface. It separates the two surfaces. So two surfaces, that is the superolateral surface and the medial surface, is separated by the superomedial border. Okay. The next border is inferolateral border. The next border is the inferolateral border. This is also seen very nicely in the picture. This is the inferolateral border. So this was the superomedial border between superolateral surface and the medial surface. Inferolateral border is between the superolateral surface and the inferior surface. So inferolateral border is between the superolateral surface and the inferior surface. So between the superolateral surface and the inferior surface is the inferolateral border, and this separates the two surfaces. Okay. So again I'll repeat, the superomedial border, it is present between the superolateral surface and the medial surface, and it will separate the two surfaces. The inferolateral border, okay, the inferolateral border is present between the superolateral surface and the inferior surface, and it will separate the superolateral surface and the inferior surface. Okay, clear? The next border is the inferomedial border. Okay, this is the inferomedial border. It has medial orbital border and medial occipital border. So this is the inferomedial border. Okay, this is the inferomedial border. It has the medial orbital border and is the medial occipital border. So medial orbital border is present between the medial surface and the orbital surface of the inferior surface. Okay. Now I told you this is the inferior surface. Yes students, this is the inferior surface. Yes. Anteriorly of the inferior surface is presence of the orbital surface, and posteriorly is presence of the tentorial surface. Clear? Now I am talking about the inferomedial border. The inferomedial border has two parts: medial orbital border, this in medial orbital border, and it has the medial occipital border. It has the medial orbital border and it has medial occipital border. You can see this is the inferolateral border, separating the superolateral surface from the inferior surface. Inferomedial border is present on the inferior surface and it is divided into two parts. As the inferior surface is divided into two parts, the inferomedial border is divided into two parts: medial orbital border, okay, and medial occipital border. The medial orbital border is present between the medial surface and the orbital surface of the inferior surface, and medial occipital border is present between the medial surface and the tentorial surface of the inferior surface. Okay. So these were the three borders of the cerebrum. Three surfaces were the superolateral surface, the medial surface and the inferior surface. Yes, the three surfaces were the superolateral surface, the inferior surface and the medial surface. So this is the orbital part of the inferior surface. This is the tentorial part. So here is the infero-medial border. If I show here in the diagram, this is the infero-medial border. Okay, it is divided into two parts, the medial orbital border and the medial occipital border. The medial orbital border is between the medial surface and the orbital surface of the inferior surface. That is the medial orbital border. So medial orbital border is between the orbital surface of the inferior surface and the medial surface. And medial occipital border is present between the tentorial surface of the inferior surface and the medial surface. Okay, so these were the surfaces and these are the borders which are present. So superomedial border. Okay, this is a superomedial border, that is between the superolateral surface and the medial surface, separating both the surfaces. Inferolateral border. Okay, it was present between the superolateral surface and the inferior surface, separating the two surfaces. And next was the inferomedial border, which is separated into two parts, the medial orbital border and the medial occipital border. Medial orbital border is present between the medial surface and the orbital surface of the inferior surface, and medial occipital border is present between the medial surface and the tentorial surface of the inferior surface. Okay, so these were the borders. Now the next part of the cerebrum are the poles. So there were three surfaces, superolateral surface, medial surface and the inferior surface. Three borders, the superomedial border, inferolateral border and the inferomedial border. And the next is the poles. There are frontal pole, occipital pole, temporal pole. Okay, so there are three poles which are present. Okay, there are three poles which are present. So what is the three poles which are present? The frontal pole, which is anterior towards the frontal lobe. Okay. Posteriorly is the occipital pole. Okay. And temporal pole. This is the temporal pole, which is between the frontal and the occipital pole. So these are the poles. This is the frontal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, occipital lobe and temporal. This was the central sulcus. This is the parieto-occipital sulcus and this is the lateral sulcus. This I have explained in my previous video. Frontal pole is anterior, occipital pole is posterior and temporal pole is between the frontal and the occipital pole. Clear? So these are the three poles: frontal, occipital, temporal. Frontal is anterior, occipital is posterior, temporal is between frontal and occipital. Okay, so cerebrum, three surfaces, three borders, three poles: superolateral surface, medial surface, inferior surface. That is the borders: superomedial border, inferolateral border, inferomedial border. Surfaces: superolateral surface, medial surface, inferior surface. Borders: superomedial border, inferolateral border, inferomedial border. And the poles. Okay. Now the sulci and the gyri, there are grey matter which are present. The raised areas are the gyri, which are the bumps which I have shown, that raised areas, and the depressed areas are the sulci. Okay. So the raised areas, these are the raised areas which are known as the gyri, and the depressed areas are known as the sulci. Okay. The lobes of the cerebral hemispheres. There are 4 lobes which are corresponding to the bones. So corresponding to the bones, there are presence of 4 lobes. Okay. Which are the 4 lobes? The frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. Okay, these are the lobes which are present in the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so I will talk about the lobes of the cerebral hemisphere in my next video. Thank you, students.